I'm Zim, and you're listening to the Helpful Photographer Podcast in collaboration with New York City Photo Safari. To register for Safari, please visit newyorkcityphotosafari.com. When to bracket. For me, there are two key reasons why I would bracket. Before I tell you my two reasons, let me explain what bracketing is. Bracketing is when you take multiple shots of the same composition at different exposures. Normally, you would bracket one stop brighter and one stop darker than what is considered your middle exposure. When we were shooting film and couldn't see whether or not we had nailed the exposure, you would bracket to make sure that one of your images was good. This is still one of the reasons I continue to bracket. Even though the latitude is so much greater with digital than with film, I still believe it's always best to nail your exposure the best you can. So when I'm in a hurry and I'm not totally sure about my exposure because I don't want to take too much time to think about it, and I know that one of my brackets will give me the correct exposure. And since digital is really cheap and missing that shot is very expensive, I just bracket. But for the most part, these days bracketing is about stacking your images in post-process. By stacking images shot at various exposures, we can create an image with details in the darkest areas as well as the brightest highlights. So if you have a situation where the scene has a lot of contrast, you would want to bracket. For instance, if you're shooting inside a church with very large, detailed stained glass windows, often what you'll find is that the inside of the church is very dark, while the details in the stone glass are blown out because it's very bright. By bracketing, you can ensure that you will have details in both areas. So now that you know when to bracket, let's talk about how to bracket. There are 3 ways to bracket. If you are shooting manually, you can move your f-stop, ISO, and shutter speed combination to get your over and under exposures. If you're shooting in program, shutter priority, or aperture priority, you can move your exposure compensation to do your bracket. Or the last option is to do an auto bracket. Not all cameras have an auto bracket feature, so you'll have to resort to the first 2 methods. But if your camera can do an auto bracket, in the lease it will allow you to do what we call a 3 bracket. Some cameras will allow a 5, 7, or even a 9 bracket. This just indicates how many frames it will automatically fire for you. In a standard 3 bracket, the camera will automatically move your settings to give you an image at -1 stop, a 0, and a +1 stop exposure. Whereas a standard 5 bracket will give you a -2, -1, 0, +1, and a +2 exposure. How many frames you need depends on how much contrast you have. You'll want to have at least an exposure that shows details in the brightest areas and exposure that show details in the darkest areas. That is, if this information is important to you. Higher-end cameras will allow you to do brackets at smaller than 1-stop increments. For me, I don't find that particularly necessary, but I'm sure this is probably helpful for some photographers. Another option is the ability to move the center away from 0. In the examples I just gave, the middle exposure is based on what the camera deems as the optimal middle gray exposure. There will be some instances where you want your brackets to be darker or brighter than what is considered your 0 exposure. To do this, you would set your exposure compensation to a plus or a minus as your center, and the camera will bracket away from that point. Although I just said that you can do this in aperture priority, shutter priority, and program modes, you need to know what happens when you do that. In aperture priority, the camera will move the shutter speeds to get to your over or under exposures. If you're shooting in situations where your overexposures may get a little bit long, you may need a tripod. On the other hand, in shutter priority, your camera will move your aperture. If you're shooting in low light with a relatively short shutter speed, you may run out of aperture to accomplish the overexposures. If you're shooting in program mode, the camera will move a combination of aperture and shutter speeds to accomplish a bracket. In all of these instances, if you have the camera set on auto ISO, it will likely move ISO in combination with f-stops and shutter speeds. It should be noted that if you're hand-holding and depending on what you're shooting, it's probably best to use aperture priority or program mode with an auto ISO to do brackets, because if you use shutter priority and have a big spread between the highest and the lowest brackets, you may see a big shift in your depth of field because it's moving the aperture around. However, if you have a tripod available, it's probably best to shoot in a static ISO and aperture priority, because then it doesn't matter how slow the shutter speed gets. However, if you have something moving in your frame, such as a waterfall, that changes the situation completely. Another thing to note with regards to auto bracket is this. If you have your camera set to single shot, which means that you need to lift your finger every time you want the shutter to fire, you will need to press the shutter for as many shots as you set your bracket to before it starts over. If, however, you put it on continuous shutter, all you need to do is to press the shutter button and hold it down until it stops. The camera will fire off all the frames you set it to and stop once the bracket is complete. Remember, you must hold your finger down until it stops, otherwise it will be left in the middle of the bracket. If you're shooting on a tripod and set the camera for a timed release, you'll also only need to press the button once. When you shoot your bracket, be sure to complete your bracket before you move on to the next shot. Otherwise, you'll start your next shot in the middle of the bracket. If you've lost your place, simply turn your camera on and off. This will reset the bracket to start over. You should know that some cameras will turn bracketing off altogether if you turn your camera off. This is a preference that can be changed in your menu. It is also possible to change the order in which your camera shoots the bracket. For whatever reason, pretty much all cameras are set to shoot the middle exposure first, followed by the underexposure, and then the overexposure. This makes little to no sense to me. But obviously someone out there thought this was a great idea because I've seen this as a default in every single camera I've ever picked up. So I set my camera to shoot the images sequentially from negative to positive. Some cameras will allow you to shoot from positive to negative. That's up to you. That's it for now. I hope that was helpful. If so, please rate us on iTunes or wherever you listen to this podcast. Until next time, keep on shooting.